Hey there, welcome to what might be one of the most intense journeys we've taken together. Tonight, we're diving into something that shook the world to its core. This wasn't just a Diddy party, we're talking about Roman orgies. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you genuinely find value in these deep dives into recent history. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. It's fascinating to see how these stories connect people across the globe, especially when they're stories that changed everything. Now, settle in, because this isn't going to be comfortable. We're about to explore life in ancient Rome. They didn't just have Diddy parties, it was far much worse. The ancient Roman orgies that most people think they know about were actually something far more disturbing and complex than anything happening in modern celebrity culture. While today's scandals might involve power, money, and questionable behavior, the Roman elite took excess to levels that would make even the most outrageous contemporary parties look like church picnics. See, when we talk about modern party culture, we're dealing with celebrities who at least have to worry about social media, lawsuits, and public opinion. Back in ancient Rome, the wealthy and powerful operated under completely different rules. They had absolute power over slaves, no concept of consent as we understand it today, and religious justifications for behaviors that would land someone in prison now. But here's the thing that makes Roman orgies genuinely terrifying, rather than just scandalous. These weren't just wild parties. They were expressions of a power structure so absolute, so divorced from basic human dignity, that the very idea of saying no simply didn't exist for most participants. When a Roman senator decided to throw a feast, everyone from slaves to foreign dignitaries knew that refusal meant social death, economic ruin, or actual death. The Bacchanalia of 186 BCE perfectly illustrates just how dark these gatherings could get. What started as religious festivals honoring Bacchus, the god of wine, evolved into something that horrified even the Romans themselves. According to the historian Pliny, these events became venues for political conspiracies, forced participation in religious rites, and acts of violence that were covered up by claims of divine inspiration. Unlike modern parties where celebrities might worry about TMZ or Twitter, Roman elites operated in a world where witnesses could be silenced permanently. Slaves who saw too much could be killed without legal consequence. Foreign guests who refused to participate might find their trade agreements suddenly cancelled, their cities facing mysterious military pressure. The psychological manipulation was far more sophisticated than anything we see today. Romans used religion, social obligation, and economic pressure to create situations where people felt they had no choice but to participate. They understood that once someone had compromised themselves at these gatherings, they became complicit, making them easier to control in political and business dealings. Take the Emperor Caligula's floating bridge across the Bay of Naples. What seemed like an extravagant party stunt was actually a demonstration of absolute power. He forced senators to walk across the bay in elaborate costumes while he rode his horse, showing that he could make Rome's most powerful men look ridiculous, and they would thank him for the privilege. Modern celebrity culture, for all its problems, operates within legal frameworks that didn't exist in Rome. Today's powerful might bend rules, but they can't literally own other human beings. They can't order executions. They can't claim divine authority for their actions. The Romans could and did all of these things. The scale of Roman excess was also unimaginable by today's standards. We're talking about events that might last for days, involve hundreds of participants, and consume resources that could feed entire cities. The Emperor Vitellius once hosted a dinner that reportedly cost the equivalent of millions of dollars in modern money, featuring exotic animals, rare delicacies, and entertainment that included actual gladiator fights to the death. But perhaps most disturbing was how normalized this behavior became. Roman writers describe these events with the same casual tone we might use to discuss a dinner party. The historian Suetonius writes about emperors forcing senators' wives to participate in degrading spectacles as if he were describing the weather. The religious aspect made everything worse. Romans believed that certain sexual and violent acts could honor the gods, meaning that refusing to participate wasn't just social suicide, it was blasphemy. They created theological justifications for behaviors that even they knew were wrong, using divine authority to override human conscience. Modern party scandals usually involve adults making bad decisions, often while intoxicated. Roman orgies involve systematic exploitation of power imbalances that made genuine consent impossible. When your emperor could have you crucified for any reason, or for no reason at all, saying no to his party invitation wasn't really an option. The aftermath was equally brutal. While modern celebrities might face public embarrassment or legal troubles, Romans dealt with blackmail, assassination, and political persecution. Participation in these events created webs of mutual compromise that bound the elite together in chains of shared guilt and mutual assured destruction. What's really chilling is how the Romans documented all of this. They kept records, wrote poems, created artwork depicting these events. They weren't ashamed. They were proud. They saw extreme excess as proof of their civilization's sophistication, their empire's power, their god's favor. Even the logistics reveal the difference in scale and brutality. Modern parties might have security, but Roman gatherings had private armies. They might have drugs, but Romans had poisons that could kill uncooperative guests and make it look natural. They might have blackmail material, but Romans had the power to make people disappear entirely. The social pressure was overwhelming in ways that modern people struggle to understand. In Rome, your social standing determined everything. Your access to food, your family's safety, your children's futures. Being excluded from elite gatherings didn't just mean missing a party. It could mean watching your family starve while former friends pretended not to know you. This is why Roman orgies were far worse than any modern scandal. They weren't just about powerful people behaving badly. They were about an entire civilization that had structured itself around the idea that some humans existed solely for the pleasure and convenience of others. They created religious, legal, and social systems that made extreme exploitation not just possible, but virtuous. So when we look at contemporary celebrity scandals, as serious as they may be, we're still dealing with a world where basic human rights exist, where legal systems provide some protection, where public opinion can force accountability. The Romans operated without these constraints, creating a form of organized excess that was limited only by human imagination and the empire's vast resources. The scariest part isn't just what they did, but how efficiently they did it, how completely they normalized it, and how they built an entire civilization around the principle that power should be unlimited and pleasure should be unrestrained. That's not just a party gone wrong. That's a society that had fundamentally lost its way, creating horrors that make even our modern scandals look tame by comparison. This isn't just a Diddy party, it's far much worse. When we look at the headlines today about powerful figures and their alleged private gatherings, we might think we're witnessing something unprecedented in human depravity. But let me tell you about ancient Roman orgies, and you'll quickly realize that what passes for scandal in our modern world barely scratches the surface of what absolute power could accomplish when there were no cameras, no social media, and no legal systems capable of challenging the elite. Today's celebrities might face lawsuits, public shame, and criminal charges when their behavior crosses the line. Roman emperors and aristocrats face no such constraints. They operated in a world where human life held little value, where slaves were property to be used and discarded, and where the concept of consent simply didn't exist for vast portions of the population. The comparison between modern celebrity excess and ancient Roman depravity reveals something disturbing about power itself. While today's scandals shock us because they violate our moral and legal frameworks, Roman orgies were often celebrated as displays of sophistication and divine favour. The wealthy didn't hide their excesses. They flaunted them as proof of their superiority over common mortals. Consider the sheer scale of what was possible in ancient Rome. Modern parties, however debauched, are still constrained by contemporary logistics and legal realities. Roman festivities could span days or weeks, involve hundreds of participants, and include levels of violence and exploitation that would be considered war crimes today. When your guest list includes gladiators, exotic animals, and human beings treated as disposable entertainment, you're operating in a realm of cruelty that makes contemporary scandals look almost quaint. The Romans had perfected the art of turning human suffering into spectacle. Their orgies weren't just about sexual excess, they were about demonstrating complete dominion over other human beings. Participants weren't just engaging in debauchery, they were participating in elaborate displays of power that reinforced the social hierarchy through humiliation and violence. What makes Roman orgies particularly chilling is how they were integrated into the fabric of elite society. These weren't secret gatherings hidden from public view. They were often semi-public affairs that served important social and political functions. Attending the right orgy could advance your career, while refusing an invitation could end it. The orgies became a tool of social control, ensuring loyalty through shared complicity in increasingly depraved acts. The religious dimension adds another layer of horror. Many of these gatherings were justified as religious ceremonies, sacred rites that honored various gods and goddesses. This divine sanction allowed participants to engage in acts that might otherwise trouble their consciences, transforming cruelty into piety and exploitation into worship. Roman record-keeping was meticulous, and the casual way these events were documented reveals how normalized such extreme behavior had become. Imperial historians wrote about orgies with the same detached tone they used to describe military campaigns or building projects. The human cost was simply irrelevant to those in power. The participants themselves came from every level of society, but their experiences varied dramatically based on their social status. For the elite, these were opportunities to display wealth and power while indulging every conceivable desire. For slaves and foreigners, they were often death sentences disguised as entertainment. The same event could represent ultimate luxury for some and ultimate horror for others. The economic machinery behind these gatherings was staggering. Entire industries existed to supply exotic foods, rare animals, elaborate costumes, and human beings for the entertainment of the wealthy. The planning could take months, involve hundreds of workers, and cost fortunes that could have fed thousands of ordinary citizens for years. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how these events served to gradually erode the moral boundaries of their participants. Each gathering pushed the envelope a little further, normalized slightly more extreme behavior, and created a culture where virtually anything became acceptable if it entertained the powerful. The orgies weren't just events, they were institutions that systematically destroyed human empathy and moral reasoning among the elite. The aftermath of these gatherings reveals another crucial difference from modern scandals. Today's powerful figures might face consequences for their actions, but Roman participants typically faced none at all. Instead, they often gained status and influence through their participation, creating a perverse incentive system that rewarded increasingly extreme behavior. The silence surrounding these events wasn't maintained through legal agreements or public relations campaigns, but through fear and systematic elimination of witnesses. Those who spoke out didn't face lawsuits, they faced execution. This created a culture of enforced amnesia, where the worst excesses could be forgotten or reframed as glorious celebrations of Roman virtue. When we compare this to contemporary scandals, we see that our modern systems, however flawed, still provide some constraints on the powerful. Roman elites operated with virtual impunity, constrained only by their own imagination and their fear of divine retribution. The result was a civilization that produced magnificent art and literature, while simultaneously perfecting cruelty as an art form. The legacy of Roman orgies isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when power operates without meaningful constraints. These gatherings represented the logical endpoint of a system that valued strength over compassion, entertainment over human dignity, and personal pleasure over social responsibility. As we drift off to sleep tonight, let us remember that the darkness we glimpse in contemporary scandals is nothing compared to the abyss that opens when civilization abandons its commitment to basic human dignity. The Romans showed us what's possible when the powerful face no consequences for their actions, when human beings become mere objects for entertainment, and when cruelty becomes art. Sleep well, knowing that for all our modern problems, we have at least maintained some barriers between power and absolute depravity. But remain vigilant, for history shows us how quickly those barriers can crumble when we stop defending them. This isn't just a diddy party, it's far much worse. While modern celebrity scandals eventually face legal consequences and public accountability, the ancient Roman orgies operated with complete impunity and systematic brutality that would make today's worst headlines look like minor infractions. The comparison between contemporary power abuse and ancient Roman excess reveals how far we've progressed in establishing boundaries, yet also exposes uncomfortable parallels. When we examine figures like Sean Combs facing federal charges and public scrutiny, we see a legal system that, however flawed, still attempts to hold the powerful accountable. But in ancient Rome, such accountability simply didn't exist. Roman orgies weren't spontaneous gatherings or even consensual adult parties gone wrong. They were carefully orchestrated displays of absolute power, designed to demonstrate that Roman elites existed beyond all moral, legal, and social constraints. These events served multiple functions simultaneously: political networking, religious ritual, social hierarchy reinforcement, and pure sadistic entertainment. The logistics alone reveal the systematic nature of these gatherings. Wealthy Romans would import exotic slaves from conquered territories specifically for these events. Young boys and girls from Gaul, Germania, and Britannia were treated as living decorations, their lives expendable for a single evening's entertainment. Unlike modern scandals, where victims can potentially seek justice, these individuals had no legal standing whatsoever. They weren't even considered fully human under Roman law. The religious aspect made everything worse. Many orgies were held in honor of Bacchus, the god of wine and ecstasy, giving participants the convenient excuse that their actions were divinely mandated. This wasn't just debauchery, it was sanctified violence. Roman priests would actually bless these gatherings, transforming rape and murder into sacred acts. The Bacchanalia scandals of 186 BCE, when the Senate finally tried to crack down on these practices, revealed gatherings where hundreds of people were murdered as part of the religious ceremonies. What made Roman orgies particularly insidious was their integration into the power structure itself. Attending wasn't optional for ambitious Romans. Refusing an invitation from someone like Emperor Caligula or Nero could mean exile, financial ruin, or death. Young senators found themselves forced to participate in acts that would destroy their souls, all while maintaining the facade of Roman virtue in public. This created a culture of complicity that reached every level of society. The contrast with modern accountability becomes stark when we consider documentation. Today's scandals leave digital trails, witness testimonies, and legal proceedings. Roman orgies were deliberately designed to create mutual blackmail. Everyone present became complicit, ensuring silence through shared guilt. The few historical accounts we have come from outsiders like early Christians or foreign observers, because participants had every incentive to stay quiet. Consider the scale difference as well. Modern celebrity scandals, however disturbing, typically involve dozens of victims over years or decades. Roman orgies could consume hundreds of lives in a single night. Emperor Tiberius's orgies on Capri reportedly featured children being thrown from cliffs after being abused, their bodies fed to sea creatures. This wasn't abuse. It was systematic extermination disguised as entertainment. The economic dimension reveals another layer of horror. These events weren't just funded by personal wealth, but by the entire imperial system. Tax money from conquered provinces bought the exotic animals, imported delicacies, and human victims. Germanic tribes would lose their children to Roman slave traders, specifically to supply these gatherings. Entire economies were structured around providing material for Roman excess. Perhaps most chilling was the casualness of it all. Modern scandals, when exposed, generate outrage precisely because we recognize them as aberrations. But in Rome, these events were simply Tuesday evening entertainment for the wealthy. Pliny the Younger writes about dinner parties where rape and murder occurred between courses, discussed as casually as the weather. The religious and legal framework made resistance nearly impossible. Roman law explicitly granted masters absolute power over slaves, including the right to kill them for any reason or no reason at all, unlike modern legal systems that at least theoretically protect all citizens. Roman law created a hierarchy of humanity, where some people existed solely for others' pleasure. The gender dynamics were equally horrific. While modern scandals often reveal men abusing their power over women, Roman orgies institutionalized the abuse of everyone deemed inferior: women, children, slaves, foreigners, and even lower-class Roman citizens. The intersectionality of oppression reached levels that modern societies, however imperfect, have at least attempted to address through legal frameworks. Even the aftermath differed dramatically. Modern victims can potentially seek therapy, legal recourse, or at least public acknowledgement of their suffering. Roman orgy survivors, if they survived at all, faced continued enslavement or social ostracism. There was no concept of trauma recovery, because trauma was considered a normal part of life for the lower classes. The comparison illuminates both how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain. While modern power structures still enable abuse, they also provide mechanisms for exposure and justice that simply didn't exist in ancient Rome. The very fact that we're having public conversations about accountability represents progress that would have been incomprehensible to ancient Romans. Yet the parallels remain uncomfortably relevant. The use of wealth and power to procure victims, the creation of complicit networks, the exploitation of legal loopholes, the targeting of vulnerable populations, these patterns persist across millennia. The difference lies not in human nature, which remains depressingly consistent, but in the guardrails society has constructed to limit the damage that unchecked power can inflict. Understanding Roman orgies isn't about ancient history. It's about recognizing what happens when power operates without accountability, when wealth can purchase human beings, and when society decides that some people simply don't matter. It's a reminder that our modern protections, however imperfect, stand between us and a return to systematic brutality that once defined civilization itself. The horror of Roman orgies wasn't their excess, it was their normalcy. They weren't aberrations in Roman society. They were features of it. And that, perhaps, is the most chilling lesson of all. This isn't just a Diddy party. It's far much worse. While Sean Combs faces modern legal constraints, public scrutiny, and potential accountability for his alleged actions, the ancient Romans operated in a world where power meant complete impunity, where violence was entertainment, and where human dignity was a luxury reserved for the elite few. Today's celebrity scandals, no matter how disturbing, unfold within systems designed to eventually expose wrongdoing. We have investigative journalism, legal frameworks, and social movements that can challenge even the most powerful figures. When allegations surface about modern moguls, they face potential prison time, financial ruin, and social exile. Their empires can crumble overnight when victims find their voices and the public demands justice. But imagine if Sean Combs lived in ancient Rome, where his wealth and status would place him among the untouchable patrician class. There would be no FBI raids, no federal charges, no Me Too movement to amplify victims' voices. Instead, his behavior would be not just protected, but potentially celebrated as the natural privilege of power. The very concept of consent as we understand it today simply didn't exist in the same form for those deemed property of the state and their masters. The Roman elite didn't just host parties, they orchestrated elaborate displays of dominance that would make today's most depraved celebrity gatherings look like church picnics. These weren't gatherings where powerful men simply exploited their positions. They were systematic celebrations of human degradation, where suffering was the main course and death was often the dessert. Consider the banquets of Emperor Caligula, where dinner entertainment might include gladiatorial combat to the death, public executions, or the sexual humiliation of senators' wives. Guests weren't just complicit observers. They were required participants in a theatre of cruelty that reinforced the absolute power of their host. To refuse participation or show disgust wasn't just social suicide. It could be literal suicide, as the emperor's displeasure often meant death. The Emperor Commodus turned his palace into a personal colosseum, where he would force aristocrats to fight as gladiators for his amusement. These weren't symbolic battles, but life and death struggles, where Rome's most powerful citizens became entertainment, their blood spilling across marble floors while the emperor laughed and applauded. The message was clear: everyone, regardless of their station, existed solely for his pleasure. But the true horror of Roman elite gatherings wasn't just their violence, it was their systematic dehumanization of entire classes of people. Slaves weren't just servants, they were living props in elaborate fantasies of power and control. At the dinner parties of wealthy Romans, human beings were routinely tortured, mutilated, and killed, as casually as we might change the music at a modern party. The historian Tacitus describes banquets where slaves were forced to fight each other to the death between courses, their blood mixing with spilled wine on the dining room floor. Others were subjected to elaborate sexual tortures designed not for the pleasure of the act itself, but for the psychological satisfaction of the guests who could witness absolute power over another human being. Women and children, whether slave or free, existed in a constant state of vulnerability that makes modern power imbalances seem almost quaint by comparison. A Roman patriarch had legal authority to kill his own children if they displeased him, and this wasn't theoretical power, it was regularly exercised. Wives could be divorced and left destitute on a whim, while female slaves had no legal protections whatsoever against any form of abuse their masters might devise. The concept of childhood innocence was utterly foreign to Roman elite culture. Children of slaves were born into a world where their bodies belonged entirely to their masters, and the sexual exploitation of minors wasn't just tolerated, but was considered a natural expression of Roman masculinity. The poet Martial casually references the sexual abuse of child slaves in his verses, treating it as humor rather than horror. What made these practices especially insidious was how they were wrapped in the language of civilization and culture. Romans saw themselves as the pinnacle of human achievement, bringing law and order to a barbaric world. Yet their private gatherings revealed the hollow core of this supposed civilization, showing how quickly refined culture could transform into savage brutality when accountability was removed. The religious justification for these excesses was equally disturbing. Many of the most violent and depraved Roman parties were connected to religious festivals honoring gods like Bacchus or Priapus, where sacred rituals became pretexts for mass sexual violence and murder. The Bacchanalia, officially banned by the Senate in 186 BCE, had reportedly become occasions for systematic rape, murder, and political conspiracy, all sanctified by religious tradition. Unlike modern scandals that eventually face exposure and consequences, Roman atrocities were often recorded with pride by their perpetrators. Emperors commissioned artwork depicting their most depraved acts, turning walls of their palaces into galleries celebrating human suffering. These weren't hidden crimes, but public declarations of absolute power, designed to inspire fear and submission in anyone who witnessed them. The scale of Roman elite entertainment was staggering in ways that dwarf modern excess. The Emperor Nero's Golden House wasn't just a residence, but a vast complex dedicated to every form of sensual and violent pleasure imaginable. Its dining rooms featured rotating ceilings that showered guests with flower petals and perfume, while hidden chambers contained elaborate torture devices for entertaining guests who desired more intense stimulation. The infamous parties of Tiberius on the island of Capri represented perhaps the ultimate expression of unchecked Roman power. Here, the emperor created a private kingdom where every fantasy, no matter how depraved, could be realized without consequence. Children were trained from birth to serve specific sexual functions, while elaborate gardens were designed as hunting grounds, where human prey could be stalked and killed for sport. What's particularly chilling about these Roman excesses is how they were systematized and institutionalized, rather than being the random acts of individual madmen. The empire developed entire industries dedicated to supplying its elite with victims. Professional slave trainers specialized in breaking the spirits of their charges, while architects designed buildings specifically optimized for torture and execution. The economic foundation of these practices reveals another layer of horror. The wealth that funded Roman elite entertainment came from the systematic exploitation of conquered peoples across the known world. Entire civilizations were enslaved to provide the human resources necessary for a single night's entertainment in a Roman villa. The suffering of millions was distilled into the pleasure of dozens. The psychological manipulation employed by Roman elites was far more sophisticated than anything we see in modern scandals. They understood that true power came not just from the ability to harm others, but from making victims complicit in their own degradation. Slaves were forced to compete for their master's favor, turning potential allies against each other and ensuring that resistance remained fragmented and ineffective. The intergenerational trauma inflicted by Roman elite culture created cycles of violence that persisted for centuries. Children born into slavery didn't just inherit their legal status, but were systematically broken psychologically, ensuring they would never develop the sense of self-worth necessary to resist their conditions. This wasn't accidental, but was a deliberate strategy to maintain control over human resources. The medical knowledge of the Romans was often perverted to serve their cruelest impulses. Physicians were employed not to heal, but to ensure that torture victims remained conscious and aware during their suffering, while surgical techniques were used to modify slaves' bodies in ways that would increase their utility or entertainment value for their masters. Human experimentation was commonplace at Roman elite gatherings, with slaves serving as test subjects for everything from new poisons to surgical procedures. The boundary between entertainment and scientific inquiry disappeared entirely when human subjects were considered expendable resources rather than beings deserving of protection. The documentation of these practices in Roman literature reveals a society that had completely normalized extreme violence and exploitation. Writers like Petronius and Suetonius describe acts of horrific cruelty with the same casual tone they might use to discuss the weather, suggesting that such behaviors had become so routine as to be unremarkable. The religious dimensions of Roman elite entertainment created a particularly twisted form of spiritual corruption. Sacred rituals were perverted to justify the most extreme forms of human sacrifice, while temples became venues for elaborate torture ceremonies that combined religious ecstasy with sadistic pleasure. The architectural legacy of Roman elite culture tells its own horrifying story. Archaeological excavations continue to uncover elaborate underground chambers designed specifically for torture and execution, their walls still bearing the marks of ancient suffering. These weren't hidden crimes, but were integrated into the very structure of Roman civilization. The legal framework that protected Roman elite behavior was designed to ensure that victims had no recourse whatsoever. Slaves couldn't testify against their masters, while free citizens who witnessed crimes against slaves faced severe penalties for speaking out. The entire system was designed to maintain a conspiracy of silence around the worst excesses of the powerful. The international scope of Roman elite entertainment reveals how their influence corrupted societies far beyond the borders of the empire itself. Local elites in conquered territories were inducted into Roman practices through carefully orchestrated gatherings that served as both entertainment and political indoctrination, spreading the culture of cruelty across the ancient world. As we examine these historical horrors, we must acknowledge that while modern power structures certainly enable abuse and exploitation, they operate within frameworks that at least theoretically recognize human dignity and rights. The Roman elite lived in a world where such concepts simply didn't exist for vast segments of the population, allowing them to indulge in levels of cruelty that would be impossible to sustain in today's interconnected, documented world. The legacy of Roman elite culture serves as a stark reminder of what human beings become when power is exercised without accountability, when wealth insulates individuals from consequence, and when entire societies normalize the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable populations. Their parties weren't just gatherings of the powerful, they were laboratories for exploring the depths of human depravity, funded by empire and protected by law. In comparing modern scandals to ancient Roman practices, we're not minimizing contemporary crimes, but rather placing them in historical context that reveals both how far we've come and how vigilant we must remain. The Romans showed us what happens when civilization's veneer is stripped away and raw power is allowed to operate without constraint. Their orgies weren't celebrations of pleasure, but monuments to the capacity for evil that lurks within unchecked authority. This isn't just a diddy party, it's far much worse. What we're about to explore makes any modern celebrity scandal look like a minor social faux pas compared to the systematic, religiously sanctioned brutality that defined Roman orgies. While today's elite parties might involve questionable behavior and power dynamics, they pale in comparison to the institutionalized violence and exploitation that characterize these ancient gatherings. The difference between modern scandals and Roman orgies isn't just one of degree, it's one of entire social structure. When we look at contemporary controversies involving powerful figures, we see individuals operating within systems that at least nominally recognize human rights, where victims can speak out, where legal consequences exist. The Romans, however, had woven these excesses into the very fabric of their civilization, creating a machine of exploitation that ran on divine authority and imperial power. Roman orgies weren't spontaneous expressions of hedonism. They were carefully orchestrated displays of absolute dominance. These weren't parties where boundaries were crossed. They were events where the very concept of boundaries had been systematically dismantled by law, religion, and social custom. The participants weren't just wealthy elites indulging in excess. They were the architects of an empire built on the principle that some humans existed solely for the pleasure and convenience of others. Consider the sheer scale of what we're discussing. While modern scandals might involve dozens of victims over years, Roman orgies could consume hundreds in a single evening. These weren't clandestine affairs hidden from public view. They were often public spectacles, sometimes held in the very temples where Romans worshipped their gods. The participants weren't afraid of exposure. They were proud of their excesses, documenting them in art, literature, and official records. The religious dimension adds another layer of horror that modern scandals simply cannot match. Today's powerful predators operate in the shadows, knowing their behavior violates social norms. Roman elites conducted their orgies under the explicit blessing of their gods, turning sexual violence into sacred ritual. They believed their brutality was divinely mandated, that their victims were offerings to deities who demanded suffering and humiliation. The participants in these events weren't just wealthy individuals. They were the living embodiments of Roman power. Senators who wrote laws, generals who conquered nations, priests who interpreted divine will, all gathered to engage in activities that would make the darkest modern conspiracy theories seem tame. They operated with the full protection of Roman law, which explicitly denied personhood to vast categories of people. When we examine the aftermath of modern scandals, we see investigations, prosecutions, social consequences. Roman orgies faced no such accountability. The perpetrators weren't hiding from justice. They were justice in the Roman conception. They wrote the laws, commanded the armies, and spoke for the gods. Their victims had no recourse, no voice, no hope of justice, because the very concept of justice had been redefined to serve the appetites of the powerful. The documentation that survives from these events reveals a level of casual cruelty that's difficult to comprehend. Roman writers described orgies the way modern journalists might cover a state dinner, as social events worthy of detailed recording. They weren't confessing to crimes. They were celebrating achievements. The torture, rape, and murder weren't unfortunate excesses. They were the main attractions. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Roman orgies, their systematic nature. These weren't isolated incidents or individual pathologies. They were institutions. Young Romans from elite families were raised to participate in these events, taught that such behavior was not just acceptable, but necessary for maintaining their social position. The empire had created a self-perpetuating cycle of violence that lasted for centuries. The economic foundation of these orgies reveals another stark difference from modern scandals. Today's elite predators, however wealthy, operate as individuals within larger economic systems. Roman orgies were funded by the systematic exploitation of entire continents. The gold that paid for these spectacles was mined by slaves worked to death in Spanish mountains. The exotic foods and wines were extracted from conquered peoples through taxation that often meant starvation. The very venues where these orgies occurred were built by slaves captured in wars of conquest. The scale of human suffering required to maintain this system is almost incomprehensible. Every Roman orgy represented not just the immediate victims, the slaves, children, and prisoners forced to participate, but the thousands of people across the empire whose labor and lives made such excess possible. The Romans had created a machine that converted human misery into elite pleasure on an industrial scale. When we consider the psychological impact on both perpetrators and victims, the differences become even more stark. Modern predators, however powerful, must still maintain public facades, must still pretend to be decent human beings in most contexts. Roman elites lived their entire lives within a system that told them such behavior was not just acceptable, but admirable. They didn't suffer from cognitive dissonance. They suffered from the complete absence of any moral framework that might create such dissonance. The victims, too, faced a different kind of horror. Modern victims, however silenced or discredited, live in a world where their basic humanity is at least theoretically recognized. Roman slaves, foreigners, and other victims were legally classified as property. They weren't just being abused, their very existence as human beings was denied by the society that tormented them. The religious justification for these orgies created a particularly insidious form of psychological control. Victims weren't just told to endure their suffering. They were told it was sacred, that their pain pleased the gods, that resistance was not just futile, but blasphemous. The Romans had weaponized spirituality itself, turning the human need for meaning and connection into another tool of oppression. Perhaps most chilling of all was the systematic nature of recruitment for these events. Roman orgies didn't rely on isolated predators seeking individual victims. They were supplied by an entire infrastructure of human trafficking that spanned the known world. Slave markets, military campaigns, and tributary relationships all fed into this system, ensuring a constant supply of fresh victims for Roman appetites. The architectural evidence that survives tells its own story of systematic horror. The villas, where these orgies occurred, weren't just luxurious homes, they were purpose-built machines for inflicting suffering. Hidden chambers, elaborate drainage systems for blood, specialized equipment for torture, all designed and constructed by skilled architects and engineers, who saw such features as normal amenities for the wealthy. As we've seen throughout this exploration, Roman orgies represented something far more sinister than individual moral failings or even organized criminal activity. They were the logical culmination of a civilization that had abandoned any pretense of universal human dignity, that had built its entire social structure on the principle that some people existed solely for the pleasure of others. The legacy of this system extended far beyond the orgies themselves. The attitudes and structures that made such events possible shaped Roman law, philosophy, art, and culture for centuries. They created precedents and justifications that would influence Western civilization long after the empire's fall, leaving traces that we're still grappling with today. When we compare this to any modern scandal, however shocking, we see the difference between individual pathology and systematic evil. Today's predators are aberrations in societies that at least aspire to human rights and dignity. Roman orgies were the natural expression of a society built on domination and exploitation, the inevitable result of unchecked power, combined with the complete dehumanization of the powerless. This isn't just a Diddy party, it's far much worse. When we think about the scandals surrounding modern celebrity gatherings, the allegations of excess and abuse, we imagine we're witnessing something unprecedented in its depravity. But the truth is, what happened in ancient Rome makes today's most shocking celebrity scandals look like church socials by comparison. While modern parties might involve drugs, coercion, and criminal behavior, they're still constrained by laws, media scrutiny, and some semblance of social accountability. The perpetrators face investigations, lawsuits, and public condemnation. There are legal systems designed to prosecute, victims who can speak out, and a society that at least pretends to care about justice. But in ancient Rome, what we euphemistically call orgies weren't just private parties gone wrong. They were systematic expressions of absolute power, where the ruling class didn't just break the rules, they were the rules. These weren't gatherings where boundaries were crossed. They were events where the very concept of boundaries had been obliterated by design. The Roman elite operated in a world where human life was literally disposable. where slaves existed solely for their master's pleasure, and where the most horrific acts weren't just tolerated, but celebrated as displays of power. When a Roman senator wanted entertainment, he didn't hire performers, he owned them. When he grew bored, he didn't send guests home, he had them killed. When he wanted to demonstrate his authority, he didn't post about it on social media. He did it in full view of other powerful Romans who applauded his creativity. These weren't parties in any recognizable sense. They were orchestrated demonstrations of what unlimited power could accomplish when freed from all moral constraints. The participants weren't guests. They were either fellow predators or victims, and the distinction often depended entirely on social class rather than consent or choice. Modern celebrity scandals, horrific as they may be, still operate within systems that recognize basic human rights. Even when those rights are violated, the perpetrators still have to hide their crimes, still face consequences when exposed, still live in societies that maintain some distinction between legal and illegal behavior. But in ancient Rome, the powerful didn't hide their cruelty, they celebrated it. They didn't fear exposure, they documented their excesses. They didn't worry about consequences, because they were the consequences, the final arbiters of life and death for everyone beneath them in the social hierarchy. What we're about to explore isn't just the story of particularly debauched parties. It's the anatomy of a civilization that had systematically removed every safeguard, every protection, every moral boundary that might have prevented the absolute worst expressions of human nature. It's the blueprint for what happens when power becomes truly absolute, when wealth eliminates accountability, and when an entire society decides that some people simply don't count as human beings. The Roman orgies weren't aberrations or exceptions to the rule. They were the logical conclusion of a system designed to concentrate absolute power in the hands of a few while reducing everyone else to the status of playthings. They represent the end point of unchecked privilege, the final destination of a society that had decided might makes right, and that the powerful deserve whatever they can take. So when we compare ancient Roman excess to modern celebrity scandals, we're not just talking about a difference in degree, but a difference in the very nature of reality itself. We're comparing crimes that still shock us precisely because they violate principles we still hold, to a civilization that had systematically abandoned those principles entirely. The Romans didn't just cross lines, they erased them. They didn't just break taboos, they made breaking taboos into an art form. And they didn't just abuse power, they transformed abuse into the very definition of what power meant. What followed wasn't just parties, but systematic dehumanization dressed up as entertainment. Not just excess, but the complete inversion of everything we might recognize as civilization. Not just crime, but the transformation of crime into virtue, cruelty into culture, and suffering into spectacle. The Roman elite had achieved something that even our most corrupt modern figures can only dream of. A world where their worst impulses weren't just indulged, but institutionalized. Where their cruelest fantasies weren't just enacted, but celebrated. Where their most depraved desires weren't just satisfied, but sanctified. And unlike modern scandals, which eventually face reckoning, the Roman system was designed to ensure that reckoning never came. The victims couldn't speak out because they were property. The witnesses couldn't testify because they were accomplices. The authorities couldn't investigate because they were the perpetrators. This was power without limits, wealth without conscience, and desire without any force capable of saying no. This was what happened when a civilization decided that some people's pleasure mattered more than other people's lives, and built every institution around protecting that principle. The stories we're about to uncover aren't just historical curiosities or ancient gossip. They're blueprints for understanding what absolute corruption looks like when it's allowed to flourish without constraint. They're warnings about what happens when societies abandon the principle that all human life has value. And they're reminders of how far civilization can fall when the powerful convince themselves that their desires justify any means. So no, this isn't just a Diddy party. It's something far worse because it's something that was never meant to end, never designed to be exposed, and never constrained by any force more powerful than the whims of those who had already decided that nothing was more important than their own pleasure. This was systematic dehumanization as entertainment, and it lasted for centuries because an entire civilization decided it was not just acceptable, but admirable. This isn't just a Diddy party, it's far much worse. When we think about modern scandals, about powerful figures exploiting their positions for sexual gratification, we imagine we're witnessing something uniquely contemporary. But the truth is, what happened in ancient Rome makes today's most shocking revelations look like a church social. The orgies of imperial Rome weren't just parties gone wrong. They were systematic displays of absolute power, religious justification, and complete dehumanization that operated on a scale and with a brutality that would make even the most jaded, modern observer recoil in horror. See, when we compare Diddy's alleged parties to Roman orgies, we're not just talking about different centuries, we're talking about entirely different concepts of human dignity. Modern scandals, however disturbing, still operate within legal frameworks. There are investigators, there are consequences, there are limits. In Rome, there were none. The emperor's word was law, and if the emperor decided that tonight's entertainment required the sexual exploitation, torture, or murder of dozens of people, well, that's exactly what happened. Take Caligula's floating brothel on Lake Nemi. This wasn't some secretive gathering of the elite trying to avoid detection. This was a public display of imperial power. Massive barges equipped with marble bedrooms, torture chambers, and altars for human sacrifice. Senators were forced to watch their wives and daughters being violated by the emperor and his guests, not as punishment for any crime, but simply because Caligula could. The victims weren't just the direct participants. Entire families were destroyed, their wealth confiscated, their names erased from history if they dared to object. But here's what makes Roman orgies truly different from anything we see today. They weren't aberrations. They weren't scandals. They were institutions. Caligula didn't invent sexual violence as imperial entertainment. He inherited it. Tiberius had already established the precedent at his villa on Capri, where he maintained what Roman historians called spintriae, essentially sex slaves of all ages trained in every conceivable form of degradation. When local families tried to hide their children, Tiberius had them hunted down by imperial guards. When senators protested, they found themselves invited to participate, with the clear understanding that refusal meant death. The religious dimension adds another layer of horror that has no modern equivalent. These weren't just orgies, they were sacred rituals. The emperor was a god, and his sexual appetites were divine manifestations. The Floralia festival, officially celebrated throughout the empire, featured public orgies where freeborn women were required to participate or face charges of impiety. Imagine a world where refusing to be sexually assaulted was considered blasphemy, punishable by death. Nero took this integration of sex, violence, and religion to its logical extreme. His golden house wasn't just a palace. It was a temple to his own divinity where human sacrifice and sexual torture were forms of worship. The famous Garden of Delights featured prisoners of war, political dissidents, and captured Christians being raped, tortured, and killed in elaborate tableaux designed to represent mythological scenes. Spectators weren't just watching, they were participating in divine worship. The scale alone defies modern comprehension. While contemporary scandals might involve dozens of victims over years, Roman imperial orgies could consume hundreds of people in a single night. The logistics were staggering. Imperial slaves whose only job was procuring victims. Entire bureaucracies dedicated to organizing, documenting, and covering up these events. Regional governors required to supply quotas of attractive slaves and captives for imperial entertainment. And unlike modern scandals, where victims can potentially seek justice, in Rome, the concept simply didn't exist. There were no investigators, no prosecutors, no courts that could challenge imperial behavior. The emperor was the law. His sexual desires were legal mandates. When Commodus decided to turn the Colosseum into his personal brothel, forcing gladiators and wild animals to participate in sexual spectacles with captured enemies, there was no authority on earth that could stop him. The documentation that survives gives us glimpses of horrors that medieval chroniclers couldn't even describe directly. Suetonius writes of Caligula's sacred marriages, where he would wed and immediately execute noble women in front of their families as offerings to himself as a god. Cassius Dio describes Caracalla's divine unions, where he would sexually torture captured barbarian leaders' children while forcing their parents to watch, claiming this transferred their tribal power to Rome. But perhaps most disturbing is how normalized this became. These weren't shocking departures from Roman values. They were expressions of Roman values taken to their logical conclusion. The empire was built on conquest, slavery, and the absolute dominance of the powerful over the powerless. Imperial orgies were simply the most intimate expression of that philosophy. The economic infrastructure that supported these events reveals their institutional nature. Entire industries existed to supply imperial sexual appetites. Slave markets specialized in children and young adults specifically for imperial use. Shipping routes were established to transport exotic victims from the furthest reaches of the empire. Craftsmen designed increasingly elaborate torture devices that combined sexual assault with prolonged suffering. When we look at the legal frameworks, the contrast with today becomes even starker. Modern scandals, however covered up initially, eventually face some form of accountability. In Rome, these activities were protected by law. Anyone who interfered with imperial sexual prerogatives faced charges of treason. Families who tried to hide their children were guilty of theft of imperial property. Even witnessing these events and showing insufficient enthusiasm could be considered disrespectful to the emperor's divinity. The religious justification created a perfect storm of horror. Since the emperor was a god, his sexual desires were divine commands. Refusing to participate wasn't just illegal, it was sacrilegious. This meant that victims weren't just being assaulted, they were being forced to participate in their own spiritual violation. Parents were required to offer their children willingly or face charges of impiety that would damn their entire family. The geographic scope was equally staggering. While modern scandals are typically localized, Roman imperial sexual violence was empire-wide. Provincial governors were expected to maintain local versions of imperial orgies. Military commanders used sexual violence as both a weapon of war and a form of entertainment for their troops. The entire Mediterranean world became a hunting ground for imperial sexual appetites. The technological innovations developed specifically for these purposes reveal the systematic nature of the horror. Roman engineers designed mechanical devices for prolonged sexual torture. Architects created buildings specifically for these events, with hidden chambers, observation galleries, and disposal systems for bodies. Physicians developed drugs to enhance suffering or prevent death during extended torture sessions. The cultural impact was profound and lasting. Entire generations grew up understanding that their bodies belonged to the state, that their children could be claimed at any time for imperial entertainment, that sexual violence was not just tolerated, but sanctified. This wasn't trauma inflicted on individuals. It was trauma embedded in the very structure of civilization. And the documentation reveals something even more chilling. These events were recorded, celebrated, and used as propaganda. Imperial orgies weren't hidden scandals. They were public demonstrations of power. Detailed accounts were distributed throughout the empire to remind subjects of their emperor's absolute authority over their bodies, their families, their very existence. The comparison to modern scandals breaks down completely when we consider the aftermath. Today's victims, however imperfect. This isn't just a diddy party, it's far much worse. What we're about to explore makes modern scandals look like children's birthday celebrations. We're delving into the ancient Roman orgies, but not the Hollywood version you might imagine. These weren't just wild parties with too much wine and questionable decisions. No, what happened in the shadowed villas and imperial palaces of Rome was something far more systematic, far more sinister, and infinitely more deadly. Today's celebrity scandals involve allegations, investigations, and consequences. But in ancient Rome, the powerful operated with absolute impunity, turning human suffering into entertainment and exploitation into art. While modern predators work in shadows and face potential justice, Roman elites celebrated their depravity openly, documented it proudly, and wove it into the very fabric of their civilization. To understand the true horror of Roman orgies, we must first understand that they weren't aberrations. They were institutions. They weren't occasional excesses, but systematic displays of power. And unlike today's scandals that eventually face scrutiny, Roman orgies were protected by law, blessed by religion, and celebrated by society. The Roman concept of sexual domination was fundamentally different from anything we recognize today. In our modern world, consent is the cornerstone of sexual ethics. In Rome, consent was irrelevant. What mattered was power, status, and the demonstration of absolute control over others. Roman law explicitly stated that citizens could do whatever they pleased to slaves, and slaves made up nearly 30% of the population in major cities. But even this legal framework doesn't capture the true scope of what occurred. Roman orgies weren't just about sexual gratification. They were elaborate theatre productions designed to showcase the complete dehumanization of the powerless. Imagine events where human beings were treated not as people, but as living props in increasingly elaborate and violent performances. The archaeological evidence we've uncovered paints a picture that would be almost unbelievable if it weren't so thoroughly documented. Frescoes from Pompeii show not just sexual acts, but systematic torture. Mosaics from wealthy Roman homes depict scenes that clearly show unwilling participants. Written accounts from the period describe events that combined sexuality with murder, torture with entertainment, degradation with religious ritual. Emperor Caligula, for instance, didn't just host orgies, he created what can only be described as human hunting grounds. Historical accounts describe events where slaves and prisoners were released into elaborate garden mazes, while wealthy Romans pursued them for sport. The entertainment would culminate in public sexual assault and execution, all while guests dined and socialized. Nero took this even further, constructing an entire artificial lake where he would stage mock naval battles using real prisoners and slaves. But these weren't just military reenactments. They were elaborate torture spectacles that ended with the survivors being distributed among the guests for further abuse. The emperor himself would participate, often dressed as various animals, in acts so depraved that even Roman historians struggled to describe them. These weren't isolated incidents or the actions of a few mad emperors. This was a cultural institution that spanned centuries and involved the highest levels of Roman society. Senators, generals, wealthy merchants, and religious leaders all participated in what can only be described as systematic human trafficking and torture on an industrial scale. The religious dimension makes it even more disturbing. Roman orgies were often framed as religious festivals honoring various gods. The cult of Bacchus, for instance, provided religious justification for events that involved the systematic abuse of hundreds of people. These weren't underground activities, but state-sponsored religious observances that drew participants from across the empire. The scale is what truly sets Roman orgies apart from any modern scandal. We're not talking about dozens of victims or even hundreds. Roman orgies regularly involve thousands of people, with elaborate supply chains designed to procure victims from across the known world. Children were bred specifically for these events. Entire populations were enslaved to feed this system. Military campaigns were planned not just for conquest, but for the acquisition of human beings for Roman entertainment. The infrastructure required for these events reveals their institutional nature. Archaeological excavations have uncovered elaborate underground complexes beneath Roman villas, complete with holding cells, torture chambers, and disposal systems. These weren't improvised spaces, but carefully designed facilities that could process hundreds of victims efficiently and discreetly. The economic impact was staggering. Some historians estimate that the Roman orgy industry consumed resources equivalent to feeding entire provinces for years. Wealthy Romans would compete to host the most elaborate and depraved events, spending fortunes on exotic victims, elaborate torture devices, and increasingly creative forms of entertainment. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how normalized this became. Roman children grew up attending these events. Roman women participated not just as victims but as perpetrators. Roman society developed an entire vocabulary around these practices, creating clinical terms for acts that we would struggle to describe even today. The contrast with modern scandals becomes even starker when we consider the aftermath. Today's powerful figures face investigation, prosecution, and social consequences when their crimes are exposed. Roman elites faced no such accountability. Their crimes were celebrated, their innovations copied, their victims forgotten. Contemporary Roman writers didn't condemn these practices. They competed to describe them in ever more elaborate detail. Poets wrote epic verses celebrating particularly creative acts of cruelty. Historians documented the events with the same clinical detachment they used to describe military campaigns or architectural projects. This wasn't a society struggling with moral questions about consent and exploitation. This was a civilization that had systematically eliminated such questions from consideration. Roman philosophy explicitly argued that some human beings existed solely for the pleasure and convenience of others. Roman law codified this principle. Roman religion sanctified it. The victims, meanwhile, disappeared from history almost entirely. Unlike modern scandals where victims can speak out, seek justice, and demand accountability, Roman victims were systematically silenced. They had no legal standing, no social protection, no hope of rescue or revenge. They existed solely as objects for consumption and disposal. The technological innovation applied to human suffering was equally disturbing. Romans developed increasingly sophisticated methods of prolonging both life and agony. They created elaborate mechanical devices designed to maximize pain while preventing death. They studied human anatomy, not to heal, but to discover new ways to inflict suffering. The social psychology was perhaps most terrifying of all. These weren't secret societies of deviants operating outside normal society. These were the pillars of Roman civilization. The same people who built aqueducts and roads, who created legal systems and administrative structures, who produced great works of art and literature, were also systematically torturing and murdering human beings for entertainment. This normalization extended to every level of society. Roman slaves who survived these events often became enthusiastic participants themselves when given the opportunity. Roman citizens who witnessed such spectacles as children grew up to host their own. The cycle of violence and dehumanization became self-perpetuating across generations. The geographical scope was equally staggering. Roman orgies weren't confined to the capital, but spread throughout the empire. Wealthy Romans in Gaul, Spain, Egypt, and Britain all participated in this system. Local populations were systematically exploited to feed the appetite for ever more exotic and elaborate forms of entertainment. The record-keeping was meticulous. Romans documented their crimes with the same bureaucratic efficiency they applied to tax collection or military logistics. They maintained detailed inventories of victims, categorized by age, origin, and intended use. They recorded innovations in torture techniques with scientific precision. They calculated the costs and benefits of different approaches to human exploitation. This documentation reveals a level of systematic planning that makes modern organized crime look amateurish by comparison. Roman orgies involved complex supply chains, sophisticated logistics, and elaborate quality control systems. They represented the industrial application of sadism on a scale that wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. The legal protections for perpetrators were absolute. Roman law not only permitted but encouraged the treatment of slaves and foreigners as objects rather than people. Citizens could literally do anything they wanted to non-citizens without fear of legal consequence. The state actively facilitated these crimes by providing venues, victims, and protection for participants. The religious justification provided additional layers of protection. Acts that might otherwise be seen as criminal were reframed as religious observance. Torture became ritual purification. Murder became sacrifice. Sexual assault became communion with the gods. This theological framework made questioning these practices tantamount to blasphemy. The artistic celebration ensured cultural transmission across generations. Roman orgies weren't just practiced, but glorified in visual art, literature, and public monuments. Children learned about these practices not as shameful secrets, but as glorious traditions. The culture actively promoted and celebrated systematic human exploitation. The economic incentives created powerful constituencies supporting the system. Entire industries emerged around the procurement, training, and disposal of victims. Wealthy Romans invested fortunes in facilities and equipment. Regional economies became dependent on supplying the Roman appetite for human suffering. The political utility made reform impossible. Roman elites used orgies not just for entertainment, but for political bonding, business networking, and social control. Participation became a mark of status and loyalty. Abstention was seen as suspicious, possibly even treasonous. The international dimension reveals the global scope of Roman crimes. Diplomatic missions regularly included arrangements for victim procurement. Trade agreements often included clauses about human trafficking. Military alliances were cemented through shared participation in elaborate torture spectacles. This brings us to perhaps the most crucial difference between Roman orgies and modern scandals. Today's powerful predators operate despite social disapproval, legal prohibition, and moral condemnation. They succeed when systems fail, when oversight breaks down, when good people look away. Roman elites operated with social approval, legal protection, and moral justification. Their crimes weren't failures of the system, but features of it. The systematic torture and murder of human beings wasn't a bug in Roman civilization, but a central component of how it functioned. Understanding this difference is crucial because it reveals how institutions, laws, and cultural norms can either protect or destroy human dignity. Modern scandals, terrible as they are, occur within frameworks that at least theoretically recognize human rights and dignity. Roman orgies occurred within frameworks specifically designed to deny such recognition to vast categories of people. The scale of suffering was almost incomprehensible. Conservative estimates suggest that millions of people were systematically tortured, raped, and murdered in Roman orgies over the centuries. These weren't casualties of war or victims of disease or accident. These were human beings deliberately and systematically destroyed for the entertainment of others. The cultural legacy persisted long after the fall of Rome. Medieval and Renaissance elites often looked back nostalgically to Roman practices. The institutional frameworks developed for Roman orgies influenced later systems of slavery, exploitation, and dehumanization. The philosophical justifications lived on in various forms for centuries. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the Roman example demonstrates how quickly and completely a society can normalize the systematic dehumanization of others. Rome didn't become evil overnight. It developed its systems of exploitation gradually, through incremental changes that each seemed reasonable in context. The warning signs were there from the beginning. Roman society was built on fundamental inequalities that made some people more valuable than others. Roman law codified these distinctions. Roman religion sanctified them. Roman culture celebrated them. The orgies were simply the logical endpoint of principles that seemed reasonable to most Romans. This gradual normalization is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from the Roman example. Societies don't usually leap from respect for human dignity to systematic torture and murder. They slide down gradually through small compromises and minor exceptions that accumulate over time until the unthinkable becomes routine. The Roman orgies weren't aberrations perpetrated by a few monsters. They were the predictable result of institutional structures that placed power above justice, status above humanity, and entertainment above dignity. They show us what happens when societies lose sight of fundamental human equality and instead organize themselves around hierarchies of worth. Today's scandals, serious as they are, occur within legal and cultural frameworks that at least acknowledge the wrongness of exploitation and abuse. Victims can speak out, seek justice, and demand change. Perpetrators face potential consequences, even when they temporarily escape them. Roman victims had no such recourse. They existed in a world specifically designed to deny their humanity, legitimize their suffering, and celebrate their destruction. They faced not individual predators, but entire civilizations organized around their exploitation. This is why the Roman example remains so relevant and so terrifying. It shows us not just what individual evil can accomplish, but what institutional evil can achieve when societies organize themselves around the systematic dehumanization of others. It reminds us that civilization and barbarism aren't opposites, but can coexist, with the same people who build beautiful temples also constructing elaborate torture chambers. The Roman orgies represent perhaps the most systematic and extensive program of institutionalized human suffering in recorded history. They weren't just crimes, but entire social systems built around crime. They weren't just individual evil, but collective evil on a scale that defies comprehension. Understanding this history doesn't just inform us about the past, it warns us about the future. It shows us how quickly societies can slide from recognizing human dignity to systematically destroying it. It reminds us that the protections we take for granted are fragile and must be constantly defended. The Roman example proves that there are indeed things worse than modern scandals, worse than individual predators, worse than isolated crimes. There are entire civilizations organized around systematic evil, entire cultures built on institutionalized suffering, entire societies that celebrate rather than condemn the destruction of human dignity. This is why we must never forget the Roman orgies, never minimize their significance, never treat them as ancient history irrelevant to modern concerns. They represent both a warning and a challenge, a warning about how far societies can fall, and a challenge to build institutions strong enough to prevent such falls in the future. The contrast between Roman orgies and modern scandals isn't just about scale or severity, It's about the fundamental question of whether societies organize themselves around protecting or destroying human dignity. Rome chose destruction and called it civilization. We must choose protection and defend it vigilantly because the Roman example shows us exactly what happens when we fail. This isn't just a diddy party, it's far much worse. When we think about the scandals rocking today's celebrity world, the abuse allegations and excessive power plays, we might assume we're witnessing something unprecedented. But compared to the systematic horrors of ancient Roman orgies, even our darkest modern scandals pale in comparison to what happened when the Roman elite gathered behind closed doors. Today's powerful figures face investigations, public scrutiny, and potential consequences for their actions. Social media exposes their behavior, journalists investigate their crimes, and legal systems can hold them accountable. But in ancient Rome, there were no such safeguards. No investigative reporters, no social media watchdogs, no human rights organizations. What happened in the villas of the Roman elite stayed in those villas, protected by wealth, status, and a legal system that treated human beings as property. The orgies we're about to explore weren't just about sexual excess. They were theatres of absolute power where the most vulnerable members of society were systematically brutalized for the entertainment of those who ruled the known world. These weren't parties that got out of hand. They were carefully orchestrated displays of dominance that would make even the most shocking modern celebrity scandal seem tame by comparison. We've spent 8 parts of this series examining how these gatherings evolved from religious ceremonies into instruments of terror, how they served as tools of political control and social conditioning, and how they created entire economies built around human suffering. We've seen how the Roman elite used divine justification and legal protections to engage in acts that went far beyond anything we associate with modern excess. But now we need to understand something even more disturbing about these ancient gatherings, something that reveals just how completely different they were from any modern comparison we might draw. Because what we haven't fully grasped yet is the sheer scale and systematic nature of what the Romans accomplished when they decided to turn human suffering into entertainment. The infrastructure required for Roman orgies was staggering in its complexity and reach. These weren't spontaneous celebrations or even carefully planned private parties. They were massive operations that required supply chains stretching across the empire, involving thousands of people in various roles, from procurement to preparation to cleanup. The logistics alone reveal how normalized and institutionalized these practices had become. Consider the procurement networks that fed these gatherings. Roman agents scoured the far reaches of the empire, not just looking for the typical slaves who might work in mines or fields, but specifically seeking out individuals who met the particular requirements of elite entertainment. They wanted variety, youth, beauty, and most disturbingly, specific vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum effect. These procurement operations were sophisticated businesses in their own right. They had established routes through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, and the eastern provinces. They maintained holding facilities in major cities where potential victims could be processed, trained, and prepared for their eventual fate. They even had what we might recognize today as marketing systems, with detailed catalogues describing the attributes and potential uses of their human merchandise. The scale of these operations becomes clear when we examine the surviving records of just a single wealthy Roman household. Archaeological evidence from Pompeii reveals that even moderately wealthy families might maintain staffs of hundreds of slaves, many of whom existed solely to serve the entertainment needs of their masters. If a middle-class Roman household required such numbers, imagine the resources commanded by the truly powerful. The Emperor Caligula reportedly maintained a staff of over 10,000 people, dedicated solely to organizing and executing his various entertainments. This wasn't just servants and guards, but specialists in every conceivable form of human degradation. There were trainers who conditioned victims to accept their fate, artists who designed elaborate scenarios of humiliation, and even what we might call theatrical directors who choreographed complex scenes of abuse for maximum impact on audiences. But the infrastructure went far beyond human resources. The architectural remains of Roman villas reveal spaces specifically designed for these activities. These weren't simple bedrooms or dining halls that could be repurposed for orgies. They were purpose-built theatres of cruelty, with sophisticated engineering that allowed for elaborate spectacles of dominance and submission. The Villa of Mysteries, outside Pompeii, despite its relatively modest size, contains frescoes that hint at the complexity of these designed spaces. The walls depict not just sexual acts, but intricate ritual scenes that suggest careful choreography and planning. If this level of detail existed in a provincial villa, imagine what the great palaces of Rome itself contained. Archaeological evidence from the Domus Aurea, Nero's Golden Palace, reveals rooms with movable floors, hidden passages, and complex water systems that could flood chambers or create artificial rivers for elaborate aquatic spectacles. These weren't accidents of design. They were intentional features created specifically to facilitate increasingly elaborate forms of entertainment. The scale becomes even more disturbing when we consider the support industries that grew up around these activities. There were entire workshops dedicated to creating specialized equipment, artisans who designed costumes and props, and even what we might call special effects specialists, who created elaborate mechanical devices to enhance the spectacle. Roman engineering, famous for its aqueducts and roads, was also applied to the systematic exploitation of human suffering. They created sophisticated systems for transporting victims, maintaining them in specific conditions, and disposing of them when they were no longer useful. The same organizational skills that built an empire were turned toward perfecting the machinery of human degradation. The economic impact of these activities rippled throughout the empire. Entire regions specialized in providing specific types of victims. Northern provinces became known for providing certain physical types, while eastern territories were valued for their supposed exotic qualities. Local economies in conquered territories were often restructured specifically to serve the entertainment needs of Roman elites. The financial records that survive from major Roman households reveal the staggering costs involved in maintaining these operations. A single elaborate orgy might consume resources equivalent to the annual output of several small towns. The fact that Romans were willing to spend such enormous sums reveals how central these activities had become to their social and political systems. But perhaps most disturbing of all was how completely normalized these practices became. The infrastructure we've described wasn't hidden or secret. It operated openly, with the full knowledge and approval of Roman society. The procurement networks were legal businesses. The specialized architecture was proudly displayed to visitors. The support industries advertised their services openly in Roman markets. This normalization extended to every level of society. Roman literature casually references these activities as routine parts of elite life. Legal documents treat the systematic abuse of slaves as a standard business practice. Even Roman religious ceremonies incorporated elements that would be recognized today as systematic torture and degradation. The Roman elite didn't see themselves as monsters. They saw themselves as sophisticated consumers of refined entertainment. They believed they were demonstrating their cultural superiority and their mastery over the natural world. The systematic suffering they orchestrated was, in their minds, proof of their divine favor and natural authority. This psychological framework allowed them to engage in acts of stunning cruelty while maintaining their self-image as civilized and cultured people. They weren't driven by sadistic impulses, but by a worldview that placed them so far above their victims that the suffering they caused barely registered as morally significant. The scale and systematization of Roman orgies reveals something profoundly disturbing about what human beings are capable of when power operates without constraint. These weren't isolated incidents of abuse by particularly twisted individuals. They were institutional practices supported by sophisticated infrastructure and defended by elaborate ideological justifications. Modern scandals, however shocking, operate within systems that at least theoretically recognize the humanity and rights of all people. Ancient Roman orgies operated within a system that explicitly denied the humanity of vast numbers of people and created elaborate machinery to exploit that denial. When we compare modern excess to ancient Roman practices, we're not just comparing different scales of the same phenomenon, we're comparing fundamentally different moral universes. And understanding this difference is crucial for grasping just how far human societies can fall when they abandon the basic principle that all human beings deserve dignity and protection. The infrastructure of Roman orgies represents perhaps the most systematic and large-scale organization of human suffering in recorded history. It shows us what happens when an entire civilization decides that the pleasure of the few justifies any amount of pain inflicted on the many. And it stands as a permanent warning about the depths to which human societies can sink when power is allowed to operate without moral constraints. This isn't just a diddy party. It's far much worse. What we're about to uncover makes modern celebrity scandals look like innocent garden parties. The ancient Roman orgies weren't underground affairs whispered about in tabloids. They were institutionalized, systematic, and celebrated as the pinnacle of power and divine favor. Today's elite gatherings, even the most depraved ones we hear about, operate in shadows, behind closed doors, with participants desperately trying to keep things secret. They fear exposure, legal consequences, social ruin. But in ancient Rome, the most horrific acts weren't hidden. They were advertised. They were state-sponsored entertainment, religious ceremonies, and political statements all rolled into one blood-soaked spectacle. Modern predators might exploit a handful of victims. Roman elites commanded entire industries dedicated to feeding their appetites. Today's scandals involve cover-ups and hush money. Roman orgies involved purpose-built amphitheaters where thousands watched as human beings were tortured for pleasure. We think we've seen the worst of human behavior in contemporary society. We haven't even scratched the surface. What the Romans normalized, systematized, and celebrated would make today's most shocking headlines seem quaint by comparison. This wasn't deviance. This was civilization, at least according to those who held the power to define it. The infrastructure alone tells the story. Modern predators work within existing systems, corrupting institutions that weren't designed for their purposes. The Romans built their systems from the ground up specifically to facilitate horrors we can barely comprehend. They had slave markets that specialized in providing victims for specific types of abuse. They had architects who designed buildings with hidden chambers for activities that would land someone in federal prison today. And unlike modern scandals that eventually face justice, Roman orgies faced no consequences because they were the law. The people committing these acts weren't breaking society's rules. They were society's rulers, creating rules that protected and encouraged their behavior. But here's what makes it truly chilling. The Romans documented everything. They were proud of it. They carved scenes into marble, painted frescoes, wrote detailed accounts. Modern predators destroy evidence. Romans created monuments to their depravity. The scale was industrial. While today's scandals might involve dozens of victims over years, Roman orgies consumed hundreds in a single evening. They had supply chains, logistics networks, breeding programs. They turned human suffering into a science. What we're about to explore isn't just ancient history. It's a blueprint for what happens when power faces no checks, when wealth recognizes no limits, when society decides that some people simply don't count as human beings. The Romans didn't stumble into these horrors. They systematically constructed them, generation after generation, until the unthinkable became routine. Modern technology might make some forms of exploitation easier, but it also makes them trackable, documentable, prosecutable. The Romans had none of these constraints. They operated in a world where the only limit on their behavior was their own imagination, and that imagination, as we'll see, was truly limitless. The participants in today's scandals know they're doing something wrong, something shameful, something that would destroy them if exposed. Roman elites felt no such shame because their society told them they were entitled to do whatever they wanted to, whoever they wanted. The difference isn't just legal or cultural, it's moral, psychological, existential, and perhaps most disturbing of all, many of these practices weren't aberrations of a corrupt few. They were mainstream entertainment, religious ritual, political tradition. The Colosseum wasn't an underground fight club. It was the heart of Roman civilization, where the empire's values were literally written in blood and sand. The economic engine behind it all dwarfs anything we see today. Modern trafficking operations, horrific as they are, work against the grain of society. Roman exploitation was society, employing thousands, generating massive wealth, supported by legal frameworks specifically designed to protect predators and criminalize resistance. We'll trace how these institutions developed, how they sustained themselves, how they evolved to become ever more elaborate and cruel. We'll see how the Romans took the darkest impulses that exist in every human society and built an entire civilization around indulging them without consequence. This wasn't ancient barbarism giving way to modern enlightenment. This was sophisticated, organized, systematic dehumanization that makes contemporary horrors look primitive by comparison. The Romans didn't lack moral understanding. They possessed it and chose to invert it, celebrating as virtuous what any decent society would condemn as monstrous. And they succeeded for centuries because they understood something that modern predators are still learning. If you control the narrative, if you make the abnormal seem normal, if you convince people that your victims deserve their fate, you can commit almost any atrocity in broad daylight. The ancient Roman orgies weren't just parties that got out of hand. They were carefully orchestrated displays of absolute power, designed to demonstrate that the elite existed beyond morality, beyond law, beyond any concept of human decency. They were statements written in flesh and blood, declaring that some people had the right to treat others as objects for their entertainment. What we're about to uncover isn't just the story of how bad things can get. It's the story of how they get that bad, how societies convince themselves that the unthinkable is not only acceptable, but praiseworthy. It's a roadmap of human moral collapse, documented with the kind of detail that only comes from a civilization that felt no shame about its darkest impulses. Because in the end, the most terrifying thing about the ancient Roman orgies isn't what happened in them. It's how easily an entire civilization convinced itself that they were not only acceptable, but admirable. It's how quickly the exceptional became routine, how smoothly the unthinkable became policy, how completely a society can lose its moral center while maintaining its intellectual sophistication. The Romans weren't ignorant savages. They were highly educated, culturally refined, technologically advanced people who chose to build their civilization around the systematic brutalization of human beings. And they did it so thoroughly, so completely, that for centuries, no one within their society questioned whether it was right. They only debated how to do it more efficiently. That's the real horror we're about to explore. Not just what humans can do to each other, but how they can convince themselves and their entire society that the worst possible behavior is actually the pinnacle of human achievement. The Romans didn't just commit atrocities, they celebrated them, systematized them, and built a 1,000-year empire on the foundation of normalized horror. And they documented it all, leaving us a record of how a civilization can descend into moral darkness while never losing sight of its own supposed greatness. They show us how the unthinkable becomes policy, how the exceptional becomes routine, and how the most sophisticated societies can be built on the most primitive cruelties. This is the story of what lies beneath the marble facades and golden rhetoric of empire. This is the story of what happens when power meets opportunity in a world without moral constraints. This is the story of the ancient Roman orgies and why they represent something far worse than anything our modern scandals can imagine. And perhaps most chilling of all, these Roman orgies reveal how quickly a civilization can normalize the unthinkable. What started as religious festivals slowly morphed into systematic torture chambers. What began as expressions of power evolved into industrialized cruelty. The Romans didn't wake up one day and decide to create hell on earth. They slid into it gradually, one compromise at a time, one justification after another. The infrastructure that supported these events tells us everything we need to know about Roman priorities. While modern party planners might worry about catering and entertainment, Roman organizers maintained detailed records of human inventory. They had specialists in pain administration. They developed architectural features specifically designed to amplify suffering. They created economic systems that turned human misery into profit margins. Consider the bureaucracy of brutality that emerged. There were officials whose entire careers were built on optimizing the efficiency of exploitation. There were architects who specialized in designing spaces that maximized psychological terror. There were accountants who calculated the precise economic value of human degradation. This wasn't madness, it was methodical evil dressed up as civilization. The religious dimension makes it even more disturbing. These weren't acts committed in defiance of the gods, but in service to them. Roman priests didn't condemn these activities, they sanctified them. The very spiritual leaders, who should have been protecting human dignity, were instead blessing its destruction. When a society's moral guardians become cheerleaders for systematic cruelty, you know you've crossed a line from which there may be no return. What's particularly terrifying is how these events were marketed to the general population. They weren't hidden away like modern scandals. They were celebrated, advertised, and anticipated. Citizens would plan their calendars around them. Families would attend together. Children would grow up thinking this was normal human behavior. The Romans didn't just tolerate evil, they turned it into entertainment. The scale of participation reveals something deeply disturbing about human nature. These weren't isolated incidents involving a few sick individuals. They were massive social events that required the active participation or passive acceptance of thousands of people. Where were the voices of dissent? Where were the moral objections? The silence is deafening and speaks to how completely a society can be corrupted when power goes unchecked. The economic implications are staggering. Entire industries emerged to support these activities. There were suppliers who specialized in providing the tools of torture. There were trainers who taught techniques of psychological manipulation. There were healers who kept victims alive longer to extend their suffering. The Romans literally built an economy around human misery, and it was profitable enough to sustain itself for centuries. The social hierarchy that emerged around these events created a pyramid of complicity. At the top were the organizers who wielded absolute power. Below them were the facilitators who made it all possible. Then came the participants who reveled in the cruelty. At the bottom were the victims who bore the cost of everyone else's entertainment. But even the observers, the servants, the guards, the cleanup crews, they all played their part in maintaining this system of institutionalized evil. The documentation of these events is perhaps the most chilling aspect of all. The Romans didn't just commit these acts, they recorded them proudly. They wrote detailed accounts of the suffering they inflicted. They created artistic representations of the pain they caused. They preserved these records for future generations to admire. This wasn't shameful behavior hidden in darkness, it was celebrated achievement displayed in the light. The long-term psychological impact on Roman society must have been devastating. When a civilization normalizes the systematic dehumanization of vulnerable people, it doesn't just affect the direct victims. It corrupts everyone who participates, witnesses, or simply knows about it and does nothing. The Romans created a society where empathy was a weakness, where cruelty was a virtue, and where human dignity was a joke. The legal framework that supported these activities reveals how completely the Romans had abandoned any pretense of justice. There were no laws protecting the vulnerable because the lawmakers were the very people exploiting them. There were no rights for the powerless because the powerful had redefined what it meant to be human. The Romans created a legal system that legitimized evil and called it civilization. The technological innovations that emerge from these events are particularly disturbing. The Romans didn't just use existing tools for their cruelty, they invented new ones. They developed techniques specifically designed to maximize psychological terror. They created architectural features that amplified physical suffering. They turned human ingenuity into a weapon against human dignity. The international dimension of these events shows how the corruption spread beyond Rome's borders. Foreign dignitaries weren't horrified by what they witnessed, they were impressed. Other civilizations didn't condemn Roman practices, they tried to copy them. The Romans didn't just corrupt their own society, they exported their evil to the rest of the known world. The educational aspects of these events reveal how the Romans indoctrinated their young. Children weren't protected from witnessing these horrors, they were encouraged to participate. Young Romans learned that power meant the right to inflict suffering, that wealth meant the ability to buy human beings, and that status meant the privilege of destroying lives. The Romans didn't just create a generation of monsters, they created a system that would produce monsters for centuries to come. The artistic and cultural legacy of these events shows how deeply embedded they became in Roman identity. These weren't aberrations that contradicted Roman values, they were expressions of Roman values. The literature celebrated them, the art depicted them, the music accompanied them. The Romans didn't just tolerate evil, they made it beautiful. The medical knowledge that emerged from these events is particularly disturbing. Roman physicians didn't use their skills to heal. They used them to extend suffering. They developed techniques to keep victims conscious longer, to maintain their physical capacity for enduring pain, to maximize the duration of their torment. The Romans turned the healing arts into instruments of torture. The religious justifications became increasingly elaborate over time. What started as simple offerings to the gods evolved into complex theological frameworks that not only permitted but required systematic cruelty. Roman priests developed detailed explanations for why the gods demanded human suffering, why the powerful had divine permission to exploit the vulnerable, and why resistance to these practices was tantamount to blasphemy. The social conditioning that made all of this possible reveals how malleable human morality can be. The Romans didn't start out as monsters, they became monsters through a process of gradual desensitization. Each generation pushed the boundaries a little further, normalized a little more cruelty, accepted a little more evil. Before they knew it, they had created a society where the unthinkable had become routine. The economic incentives that sustained these activities created a vicious cycle that became almost impossible to break. So many people had financial interests in maintaining the system that any attempt at reform would have threatened entire industries. The Romans created an economy where doing the right thing was economically devastating, while doing the wrong thing was financially rewarding. The political utility of these events cannot be overstated. They weren't just entertainment for the elite, they were tools of social control. They demonstrated to the general population what happened to those who challenged the established order. They provided outlets for violent impulses that might otherwise be directed at the government. They created a sense of shared complicity that made rebellion psychologically difficult. The international trade networks that supported these activities reveal how global the corruption became. The Romans didn't just exploit their own citizens, they created supply chains that reached across the known world. They established trade routes specifically designed to funnel vulnerable people toward their destruction. They turned human trafficking into a multinational industry. The seasonal rhythms of these events show how completely they had been integrated into Roman life. These weren't spontaneous outbursts of cruelty, they were scheduled activities that people planned their lives around. The Romans created calendars of suffering, annual cycles of systematic evil that became as predictable as the harvest. The technological innovations that emerged from trying to document these events are particularly chilling. The Romans developed new techniques for preserving records of human suffering. They created artistic methods for capturing expressions of pain. They invented ways to make the temporary permanent, to ensure that moments of agony would be remembered forever. The psychological techniques that developed around these events reveal a sophisticated understanding of human nature that was used for evil purposes. The Romans didn't just inflict physical pain, they mastered the art of psychological torture. They understood how to break human spirits, how to destroy hope, how to make death seem like mercy. The architectural legacy of these events can still be seen today. The Romans built structures specifically designed to facilitate systematic cruelty, and some of these buildings still stand. They created spaces that were engineered to amplify suffering, to maximize terror, to turn human anguish into a spectacle. These buildings are monuments to humanity's capacity for evil. The literary records that survive from this period are perhaps the most disturbing evidence of how completely Roman society had been corrupted. These aren't secret documents hidden away in shame, they're public records written with pride. Roman authors described these events with the same enthusiasm they might use to describe a successful military campaign or a beautiful sunset. The training programs that emerged around these activities reveal how systematically the Romans approached their cruelty. They didn't just rely on natural sadism, they developed curricula for teaching torture techniques. They created educational programs for maximizing human suffering. They turned cruelty into a science with its own body of knowledge and specialized practitioners. The supply chain management that these events required shows how completely they had been integrated into Roman commerce. There were merchants who specialized in providing the materials needed for systematic torture. There were logistics experts who coordinated the movement of victims. There were inventory managers who tracked human beings like any other commodity. The insurance and financial instruments that developed around these activities reveal how completely they had been normalized. Romans created financial products to hedge against the risks of their investments in human misery. They developed insurance policies to protect against the loss of their human property. They turned suffering into a tradable commodity with its own market dynamics. The diplomatic protocols that emerged around these events show how they became tools of international relations. Foreign ambassadors weren't invited to normal state dinners. They were invited to witness systematic cruelty. The Romans used these events to demonstrate their power, to intimidate potential enemies, and to test the moral boundaries of their allies. The communication networks that supported these activities reveal how efficiently the Romans could coordinate evil. They developed systems for sharing information about techniques, for coordinating schedules, for managing the logistics of large-scale cruelty. They created information networks that made systematic evil more efficient and effective. The quality control measures that emerged around these events are particularly disturbing. The Romans didn't just tolerate sloppy cruelty, they demanded excellence in evil. They developed standards for measuring the effectiveness of torture techniques. They created metrics for evaluating the success of psychological manipulation. They turned human suffering into a performance art with its own standards of excellence. Now, as we consider what all of this means, we must confront some uncomfortable truths about human nature and civilization itself. The Romans weren't aliens from another planet. They were human beings like us. They had the same capacity for love, creativity, and nobility that we do. Yet they created a system of institutionalized evil that operated for centuries with the enthusiastic participation of millions of people. This raises terrifying questions about our own society. Are we really so different from the Romans? Are our moral safeguards really so strong that we couldn't slide into similar darkness? The answer, if we're honest, is that we're probably more similar to the Romans than we'd like to admit. The same human nature that enabled their systematic cruelty exists in us today. The difference isn't that we're morally superior to the Romans, it's that we have different institutions, different constraints, and different cultural narratives. We have legal systems that, however imperfect, still recognize basic human rights. We have religious and philosophical traditions that, however flawed, still affirm human dignity. We have social movements that, however limited, still advocate for the vulnerable. But these safeguards are fragile and they can be eroded. We've seen in our own time how quickly societies can abandon moral principles when they become inconvenient. We've witnessed how easily people can be convinced to dehumanize their neighbors. We've observed how readily institutions can be corrupted when the incentives are aligned correctly. The Roman example shows us what happens when these safeguards fail completely. It reveals the destination toward which our worst impulses naturally tend. It demonstrates the kind of society we create when power goes unchecked, when wealth becomes the only value, and when human dignity becomes negotiable. This is why the comparison with modern scandals like those surrounding Diddy is so important. Not because the modern scandals aren't serious, they absolutely are, but because they help us understand how far we could fall if we're not vigilant. The Romans didn't start with industrial-scale torture chambers. They started with parties that gradually got out of hand. The progression from excess to evil is gradual, almost imperceptible. Each step seems like a small compromise, a minor relaxation of standards, a temporary suspension of normal rules. But these small steps add up, and before you know it, you've traveled a vast distance from where you started. The Romans teach us that there's no flaw to human depravity when the constraints are removed. The institutional nature of Roman evil is particularly relevant to our current moment. It wasn't just a few bad actors causing problems, it was systematic corruption that infected every aspect of society. It wasn't just individual moral failure, it was institutional moral collapse. This is what makes it so much more dangerous than isolated incidents of wrongdoing. When institutions become corrupted, they don't just fail to prevent evil, they actively facilitate it. They provide cover for wrongdoing, they create incentives for participation, and they punish those who object. The Romans created institutions that were specifically designed to enable systematic cruelty, and these institutions became self-perpetuating. The economic dimensions of Roman evil are particularly relevant to our current economic system. The Romans created markets in human suffering, and these markets operated according to their own logic. They rewarded cruelty, they punished compassion, and they created financial incentives for expanding the system. Once these economic incentives were established, they became incredibly difficult to change. The religious and cultural justifications that the Romans developed for their actions are also relevant to our current moment. They didn't just commit evil acts. They created elaborate ideological frameworks that made these acts seem necessary, even virtuous. They convinced themselves that their cruelty was actually serving a higher purpose, that their victims deserved their fate, and that opposition to their actions was morally wrong. The social psychology of Roman evil is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all. The Romans didn't just tolerate evil, they celebrated it. They didn't just permit cruelty, they demanded it. They created a society where participating in systematic evil was a mark of status, where refusing to participate was a sign of weakness, and where objecting to the system was a form of social suicide. This reveals something profound about human nature that we ignore at our peril. Human beings are social creatures, and we're incredibly susceptible to social pressure. We want to fit in, to be accepted, to be part of the group. When the group norms become corrupted, most people will go along rather than face social isolation. The Romans understood this and weaponized it. The gradual nature of moral corruption is another crucial lesson from the Roman experience. Societies don't usually collapse into evil overnight. They slide into it gradually. Each generation accepts a little more cruelty than the previous one, normalizes a little more evil, compromises a little more of their humanity. Before they know it, they're living in a world their grandparents would have found unrecognizable. This is why vigilance is so important. We can't wait until we're already deep into the darkness to start objecting. We have to recognize the early warning signs, the small compromises, the gradual erosion of standards. We have to be willing to draw lines and defend them, even when it's inconvenient, even when it's costly, even when it's socially unpopular. The Roman example also shows us how important it is to have strong institutions that can resist corruption. When institutions become captured by those who would exploit them, they become tools of oppression rather than protection. The Romans had institutions, but they were designed to serve the powerful rather than protect the vulnerable. The role of leadership in moral corruption cannot be overstated. The Romans had leaders who not only permitted evil, but actively encouraged it. They had leaders who used their positions to facilitate cruelty rather than prevent it. They had leaders who saw human suffering as entertainment rather than tragedy. This is why the character of our leaders matters so much. It's not just about their policies or their competence, it's about their fundamental values and their basic humanity. Leaders who are willing to dehumanize some people will eventually be willing to dehumanize anyone who becomes inconvenient. The Romans teach us that the corruption of leadership is the beginning of the corruption of society. The international dimensions of Roman evil are also relevant to our globalized world. The Romans didn't just corrupt their own society, they exported their corruption to others. They created international networks that facilitated systematic cruelty. They used their power and influence to spread their twisted values across the known world. In our interconnected world, the potential for this kind of moral contagion is even greater. Bad ideas can spread faster than ever before. Corrupt practices can be scaled up and replicated across continents. The tools of oppression can be shared and improved upon. The Romans show us what happens when evil becomes globalized. The technological aspects of Roman evil are particularly relevant to our current technological moment. The Romans used their technological capabilities to make cruelty more efficient and effective. They turned human ingenuity into a weapon against human dignity. They used their tools to amplify suffering rather than alleviate it. We live in an age of unprecedented technological power, and we face choices about how to use that power. We can use it to enhance human flourishing or to facilitate human exploitation. We can use it to protect the vulnerable or to make them more vulnerable. The Romans remind us that technology is morally neutral, but the uses we put it to reveal everything about our values. The parallels between ancient Roman excesses and modern scandals, like the Diddy parties, become starkly apparent when we examine the underlying mechanisms of power, control, and exploitation. Both represent closed systems where wealth and influence create bubbles of perceived invincibility, where the powerful believe themselves above consequence and accountability. The Roman elites and modern celebrities alike cultivated networks of enablers, from administrators and security personnel to legal advisors and media manipulators, all working to maintain the facade and protect the perpetrators. However, the scale and systematic nature of Roman debauchery dwarfs anything we see today. While modern scandals involve dozens or perhaps hundreds of participants over years, Roman orgies could involve thousands in a single event, with the infrastructure of an entire empire supporting and facilitating these activities. The Romans didn't just throw parties, they built temples, bathhouses, and entire complexes dedicated to their excesses. They created religious justifications, legal frameworks, and cultural norms that made their behavior not just acceptable, but celebrated. The documentation aspect reveals another crucial difference. Modern perpetrators go to great lengths to hide their activities, using non-disclosure agreements, intimidation, and destruction of evidence. The Romans, by contrast, commissioned artists to immortalize their deeds, poets to celebrate them, and historians to record them for posterity. They were proud of their excess, seeing it as a demonstration of their power and sophistication. Mosaics depicting graphic scenes weren't hidden away, but displayed prominently in public spaces and private homes alike. The religious integration of these practices in Roman society represents perhaps the most disturbing aspect of their systematic approach. While modern scandals operate in opposition to stated religious and moral values, Roman orgies were often conducted as religious ceremonies, with priests and priestesses participating and blessing the proceedings. This wasn't rebellion against societal norms, but the fulfillment of them. The worship of Bacchus, the festivals of Lupercalia, and countless other religious observances provided divine sanction for activities that would horrify modern sensibilities. The economic dimension further illustrates the systematic nature of Roman excess. Entire industries existed to support these activities, from slave traders specializing in particular types of victims to craftsmen creating specialized implements and furnishings. Architects designed spaces specifically for orgies. Engineers developed complex systems for heating and water supply, and merchants imported exotic foods, wines, and substances from across the known world. The economic impact was so significant that disrupting these activities could affect entire regions of the empire. Modern scandals, while certainly involving significant financial resources, operate more as parasitic activities on legitimate businesses and industries. The Romans, however, built legitimate economic sectors around their excesses, with respectable citizens earning their living by facilitating activities that we would now recognize as systematic abuse and exploitation. The legal framework supporting Roman orgies presents another stark contrast to modern situations. Today's legal systems, while imperfect, generally recognize the rights of victims and provide mechanisms for justice, even if they don't always function effectively. Roman law, however, explicitly denied basic human rights to vast categories of people, making it legally impossible for most victims to seek redress. Slaves had no legal standing, women had limited rights, and even free citizens of lower classes faced significant barriers to challenging the powerful. The cultural normalization process in Rome took centuries to develop and became so deeply embedded that even critics of particular emperors or practices rarely questioned the fundamental assumptions underlying the system. Modern society, despite its flaws, maintains competing voices and alternative viewpoints that can challenge powerful individuals and institutions. Roman society, at its height of decadence, had largely eliminated such opposition through a combination of co-optation, intimidation, and genuine belief in the righteousness of their way of life. The role of spectacle in Roman orgies also distinguishes them from modern scandals. These weren't private affairs conducted in secret, but public demonstrations of power designed to awe and intimidate. The message was clear: we are so powerful that we can do anything, and you will not only tolerate it, but celebrate it. Modern scandals, when exposed, typically result in shame and attempts at damage control. Roman orgies, when successful, resulted in increased prestige and political power for the organizers. The technological and logistical sophistication of Roman orgies represents another area where ancient practices exceeded modern equivalents. The Romans developed complex systems for managing large-scale events, including crowd control, supply chains, and waste management that would challenge modern event planners. They created architectural innovations specifically for these purposes, from the design of amphitheaters to the engineering of private villa complexes. Modern technology certainly enables new forms of exploitation and documentation, but the Romans achieved remarkable logistical feats using only ancient technology and massive human resources. The international dimension of Roman orgies also sets them apart from modern scandals. While today's powerful individuals might engage in sex tourism or import victims from vulnerable countries, the Romans operated on the scale of an empire, systematically exploiting entire populations across 3 continents. Their activities weren't limited by national boundaries, extradition laws, or international pressure, because they were the international system. The artistic and intellectual justification for Roman excesses represents perhaps the most chilling aspect of their systematic approach. Unlike modern perpetrators, who generally cannot publicly defend their actions, Roman elites developed sophisticated philosophical and artistic frameworks that portrayed their behavior as the natural expression of superior beings. They created entire schools of thought that justified exploitation as natural law and celebrated cruelty as aesthetic achievement. The decline of Roman orgies offers insights into how such systematic evil eventually collapses. It wasn't external pressure or moral awakening that ended these practices, but rather the economic and social unsustainability of the system itself. The resources required to maintain such elaborate excesses eventually exceeded even the Roman Empire's capacity to provide them. The breakdown of social cohesion, the collapse of economic systems, and the rise of Christianity all contributed to the eventual abandonment of these practices. This historical perspective provides crucial context for understanding modern scandals and their potential trajectory. While the Didi parties and similar contemporary events represent serious crimes and moral failures, they lack the systematic, institutional support that made Roman orgies so devastating and long-lasting. Modern scandals typically involve individual actors or small networks operating against societal norms, while Roman orgies represented the full expression of societal values and institutional power. The comparison ultimately serves as both a warning and a source of hope. It demonstrates how far human societies can descend when power becomes concentrated and unchecked, when institutions fail to protect the vulnerable, and when cultural norms evolve to celebrate rather than condemn exploitation. The Roman example shows that even the most sophisticated civilizations can become engines of systematic cruelty when the right conditions align. However, it also demonstrates that such systems are ultimately unsustainable and that societies can recover from even the most profound moral failures. The fall of Rome and the eventual development of different value systems prove that historical trends are not inevitable and that human societies can choose different paths. The key lesson from this comparison is the importance of maintaining institutional checks on power, protecting the rights of the vulnerable, and preserving cultural values that prioritize human dignity over the appetites of the powerful. Modern scandals, while serious, remain aberrations precisely because our institutions and values, however imperfect, still recognize them as aberrations rather than celebrations. So what does this tell us about human nature and the societies we build? The comparison between Diddy's alleged parties and Roman orgies reveals something profound about power, accountability, and moral boundaries. When we look at modern scandals, we see individuals operating in shadows, knowing their actions are wrong, facing potential consequences from law enforcement, media scrutiny, and social condemnation. These are the actions of people who understand they're transgressing against established moral norms. But in ancient Rome, we witnessed something far more terrifying. An entire civilization that had normalized and celebrated cruelty as entertainment, where the most heinous acts weren't hidden but performed publicly as spectacle. The Roman elite didn't sneak around in private mansions. They built amphitheaters and dedicated spaces for their depravity, supported by massive economic systems designed to facilitate human suffering. The key difference lies in institutionalization. Modern scandals, however shocking, represent individual corruption within systems that still recognize basic human dignity. Roman orgies represented systematic dehumanization, supported by law, religion, and culture. They had centuries to perfect their methods of exploitation, creating supply chains of human misery that spanned continents. This historical perspective should both reassure and terrify us. It's reassuring because it shows how far we've progressed. Our modern legal systems, human rights frameworks, and cultural values create barriers that simply didn't exist in ancient Rome. When powerful people transgress today, they face consequences that would have been unthinkable to a Roman senator. But it's terrifying because it demonstrates how quickly moral boundaries can erode when power goes unchecked. Rome didn't become a monument to cruelty overnight. It was a gradual process of normalizing violence, dehumanizing victims, and celebrating excess. Each generation pushed the boundaries further until what would horrify us became routine entertainment. The Romans documented their practices proudly, never imagining future generations would view their civilization as a cautionary tale. They believed their power made them righteous, their victories justified their methods, and their cultural achievements excused their crimes. As we drift off to sleep tonight, we can take comfort in knowing that while our world isn't perfect, the legal and cultural safeguards we've built make systematic institutionalized evil far more difficult to achieve. But we must remain vigilant, because history shows us that the distance between civilization and barbarity is shorter than we'd like to believe, and the price of crossing that line is measured in human suffering that echoes through millennia.